Jake Morrison was having one of those mornings where everything seemed to go wrong. His old pickup truck had been making strange noises for weeks. 3 of his best cattle had somehow broken through the fence during the night, and the bank had called twice about his overdue loan payment. At 52 years old, Jake had been running his family ranch in Montana for nearly 3 decades. But lately, it felt like he was fighting a losing battle against rising costs and falling cattle prices. He sat in Ruby's diner that Tuesday morning, stirring his black coffee and staring at the stack of unpaid bills he'd brought with him. The diner was nearly empty except for old Pete Williams, who came in every morning at 7 sharp to read the paper and complain about the weather. Ruby herself was behind the counter, humming some tune from the radio while she cleaned the same coffee pot for the 3rd time. Jake wasn't really reading the local newspaper spread out in front of him. His mind was elsewhere, trying to figure out how he was going to make the ranch profitable again. His grandfather had started the Morrison Ranch back in 1952, and his father had built it into something respectable. Now here Jake was, possibly the last Morrison to work the land, watching it all slip away one bill at a time. That's when the small classified ad caught his eye. It was tucked away in the corner of page 12, between an ad for a used tractor and someone selling homemade quilts. The headline was so bizarre that Jake had to read it twice to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Ghost town for sale, $100, serious inquiries only. Jake almost laughed out loud. $100 for an entire town? Even a ghost town had to be worth more than that. He figured it was probably some kind of joke or maybe a scam targeting gullible people with more money than sense. But something about the ad kept nagging at him. The contact information looked legitimate enough, and there was something about the simple, straightforward wording that didn't seem like the usual scammer nonsense he'd seen before. He pulled out his phone and stared at the number for a long time. What did he have to lose? $100 wasn't going to save his ranch, but it wasn't going to break him either. Maybe this was just the kind of crazy opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime. Or maybe he was just desperate enough to believe in something that sounded too good to be true. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. The voice on the other end was gravelly and tired, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. "Hello, this is Thomas." Jake cleared his throat. "Hi there, I'm calling about your ad in the paper. The one about the ghost town." There was a long pause. "You serious about this, son?" "I've had about 20 people call me today, and most of them think it's some kind of joke." "Well, I'm not sure what to think," Jake admitted. "But I've got $100, and I'm curious enough to find out if you're serious too." Thomas Whitfield, as he introduced himself, sounded like a man who'd reached the end of his rope. His family had owned the old mining town of Cerro Gordo in Nevada for more than 40 years. His father had bought it back in the 1980s with dreams of turning it into some kind of tourist attraction, but those plans never worked out. Now Thomas was getting older, living on Social Security, and he simply couldn't afford the property taxes anymore. "The county's been after me for 3 years about those taxes," Thomas explained. "I'm looking at losing the whole place anyway if I don't come up with the money soon. I'd rather see it go to someone who might actually do something with it than let the government auction it off to some developer who will probably just tear everything down." Jake found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested now. "So this is a real place, an actual town?" "Real as the day is long," Thomas said. "Built back in the 1870s, when they were pulling silver out of those mountains like it was going out of style. Got a hotel, saloon, general store, about 30 other buildings scattered around. Most of them are still standing, though they need work. Been abandoned since the early 1900s when the silver ran out." The more Thomas talked, the more intrigued Jake became. This wasn't some empty lot with a historical marker. This was an entire piece of American history, sitting out there in the Nevada desert, waiting for someone to care about it again, and for some reason that Jake couldn't quite explain, the idea of owning a ghost town appealed to him in a way that surprised even himself. "Where exactly is this place?" Jake asked. "About 3 hours south of Reno, up in the Sierra Nevada mountains." "It's remote, I'll give you that. Nearest neighbor is probably 20 miles away. and you've got to drive the last 10 miles on dirt roads that haven't been maintained in decades. But the views are something else, and if you like peace and quiet, you won't find anywhere quieter. Jake thought about his ranch, with its constant noise of machinery and animals and the never-ending list of things that needed fixing. The idea of a place where he could go and just think, without the pressure of bank payments and feed bills, sounded almost too good to be true. They talked for another 20 minutes, with Thomas explaining the details of the sale. The deed was clear. The property taxes were about $2,000 a year, and there were no liens or other complications. He'd inherited the place from his father and had been trying to figure out what to do with it ever since. The $100 price tag wasn't really about the money. Thomas just wanted to know that whoever took over Cerro Gordo would respect what it was and maybe give it the attention it deserved. "I can meet you there this weekend if you're serious," Thomas offered. "Bring cash, bring the title paperwork, and we can get this done, but I've got to warn you, son. This isn't some easy investment opportunity. This place will either capture your heart or drive you crazy, maybe both." After Jake hung up the phone, he sat in Ruby's diner for another hour, drinking coffee and thinking. Ruby had refilled his cup 3 times without him even noticing. The breakfast crowd had come and gone, and now it was just him and his thoughts. His rational side told him this was probably a mistake. He had enough problems trying to keep his ranch afloat without taking on some crumbling ghost town in the middle of nowhere, but there was another part of him, a part that had been quiet for too long, that was practically jumping up and down with excitement. When was the last time he'd done something completely unexpected? When was the last time he'd taken a chance on something just because it felt right, not because it made financial sense? By the time he left the diner, Jake had made up his mind. He was going to Nevada to buy a ghost town for $100. It might be the smartest thing he'd ever done, or it might be the dumbest. But either way, it was going to be interesting. The drive to Nevada took Jake longer than he'd expected. What should have been a straightforward 8-hour trip turned into nearly 12 hours of wrong turns, gas station stops, and increasingly rough roads. By the time he reached the coordinates Thomas had given him, the sun was already starting to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Jake pulled his pickup truck to a stop at what looked like nothing more than a weathered wooden sign that read Cerro Gordo, elevation 8,375 feet. The sign was so faded and beaten up by years of mountain weather that he almost missed it entirely. For a moment he wondered if he'd taken another wrong turn. All he could see was a narrow dirt road winding up into the rocky hills. Disappearing around a bend about half a mile ahead, his phone had lost signal about 20 miles back, so there was no way to call Thomas and confirm he was in the right place. Jake sat in his truck for a few minutes, listening to the engine tick. As it cooled down and watching the wind blow dust devils across the empty landscape, the silence was unlike anything he'd experienced back home on the ranch. Even on the quietest nights in Montana, there were always sounds, cattle moving around, the barn creaking, or the distant hum of the highway. Here, the only sound was the wind whistling through the rocks. He put the truck back in gear and started up the dirt road. The path was rougher than anything he'd driven on before, full of rocks and deep ruts that made his truck bounce and lurch with every turn. More than once he wondered if his old pickup was going to make it to the top. The road climbed steadily upward, winding through scrub brush and scattered boulders that looked like they'd been there since the beginning of time. Then, as he came around a sharp curve, Jake saw something that made him hit the brakes so hard. His truck skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust. Spread out before him was an entire town, just sitting there in the middle of nowhere like something out of an old Western movie. Buildings lined both sides of what had once been a main street, their wooden walls weathered to a silvery gray that almost glowed in the fading sunlight. Jake climbed out of his truck and just stood there, taking it all in. This wasn't some tourist attraction with gift shops and parking lots. This was the real thing, a genuine piece of the Old West that time had simply forgotten. The buildings looked exactly like they would have 150 years ago, except for the broken windows and the way some of the roofs sagged under the weight of decades. He could see the hotel that Thomas had mentioned, A two-story building, with a wide front porch that ran the entire length of the structure. Next to it was what had to be the old saloon, with its distinctive swinging doors hanging crooked on rusty hinges. Across the street stood the general store, its painted sign so faded that Jake could barely make out the words dry goods. Beneath layers of peeling paint, the silence up here was even more intense than it had been down on the main road. Jake felt like he was walking through a museum, except this museum was completely open to the sky and weather. Every footstep on the wooden sidewalks echoed between the buildings, and the wind made the old structures creak and groan, like they were trying to tell him stories about the people who used to live and work here. Thomas's truck was parked near the hotel, and Jake could see the older man sitting on the front steps, smoking a cigarette and looking out over the valley below. When he spotted Jake, Thomas stood up and walked over with the slow, careful steps of someone whose joints had seen too many hard years. "You made it," Thomas said, extending a weathered hand. "Wasn't sure you would, to be honest. That last stretch of road scares off a lot of folks." Jake shook his hand and looked around again, still trying to process what he was seeing. "This is incredible. I mean, I knew you said it was a real ghost town, but seeing it in person is something else entirely." Thomas nodded and took another drag from his cigarette. "My daddy used to bring me up here when I was a kid. Back then, some of the buildings still had furniture in them. Left behind when the last families moved out in the early 1900s. Most of that stuff's gone now, taken by souvenir hunters and folks who figured nobody would miss it." They walked slowly down the main street, with Thomas pointing out the different buildings and sharing what he knew about their history. The old mining office still had a safe built into the wall, though someone had long since cracked it open and taken whatever had been inside. The barber shop had an actual barber chair, rusted and falling apart, but still recognizable for what it was. The town had about 300 people at its peak, Thomas explained as they stopped in front of the general store. Miners mostly, but also the shopkeepers and families that came to serve them. When the silver played out, people left fast. Some of them didn't even bother to take their belongings, just packed up what they could carry and headed for the next boomtown. Jake tried to imagine what this place would have looked like when it was alive and bustling. Children playing in the street, miners coming down from the hills covered in dust and sweat, women hanging laundry behind the houses. Now all that remained were the empty buildings and the wind dot as the sun continued to set, casting the ghost town in shades of orange and purple. Thomas pulled out a manila envelope from his truck. Inside were the deed, some old survey maps, and a ring of keys that looked like they'd been collecting dust for decades. "Most of these keys don't open anything anymore," Thomas said, holding up the ring. "Locks get rusty, wood swells and warps. But the hotel and the saloon still have doors that work in case you want to spend the night up here sometime." The transaction itself took less than 10 minutes. Jake handed over a cashier's check for $100. Thomas signed over the deed, and just like that, Jake Morrison became the owner of an entire ghost town. It felt surreal, like he was participating in some elaborate joke that he didn't quite understand yet. After Thomas drove away, his taillights disappearing down the mountain road, Jake found himself completely alone in Cerro Gordo. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. He walked back to the hotel and tried one of the keys Thomas had given him. To his surprise, the front door opened with a loud creak that echoed through the empty building. Inside, the hotel lobby was filled with dust and debris, but he could still see traces of what it had once been. A reception desk sat against one wall, and a grand staircase led up to the second floor. Jake pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight and carefully climbed the stairs, listening to each step groan under his weight. The second floor had a long hallway with doors on both sides. Like any hotel, Jake tried a few of the doors and found small rooms with broken windows and floors, covered in years of accumulated dirt and leaves. But the bones of the building were still solid, and he could see that with some work, this place could be something special again. Standing alone in that empty hotel as darkness fell over the mountains, Jake realized he just made either the best or worst decision of his life. Only time would tell which one it was. Jake spent his first night in Cerro Gordo sleeping in the back of his pickup truck. The hotel might have been structurally sound, but he wasn't quite ready to trust those old floors with his full weight during the night. He brought a sleeping bag and some basic supplies, figuring he'd camp out for a few days while he got a feel for the place. When he woke up the next morning, the mountain air was crisp and clean in a way that made his lungs feel like they were getting their first real breath in years. The sunrise painted the rocky peaks around him in shades of gold and pink that no photograph could ever capture. For the first time in months, Jake felt something that might have been peace. After a breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, he decided to start exploring his new property more systematically. Thomas had mentioned about 30 buildings scattered around the town, and Jake figured he should at least know what he owned before he started making any plans. He started with the buildings along the main street, working his way from one end to the other. The general store was bigger than it had looked from the outside, with shelves that still lined the walls and a large counter near the front. Someone had left an old cash register behind, its brass fittings tarnished green but still impressive. Jake tried to imagine what it would have been like to run a store in a place like this, serving miners and their families, who lived so far from civilization. It was while he was examining the store's back room that Jake noticed the first thing. That didn't quite fit. There, near the rear door, was a small pile of empty cans. Not old cans from the 1800s, but modern aluminum cans that couldn't have been there more than a few months. Soup cans, mostly, and a few that had contained beans. The labels were faded from sun and weather, but they were definitely recent. Jake picked up one of the cans and turned it over in his hands. Thomas hadn't mentioned anything about people coming up here regularly. In fact, he'd made it sound like the place was completely abandoned and rarely visited. So where had these cans come from? He continued his exploration with a new sense of awareness, paying attention to details he might have missed before. Behind the hotel, he discovered something that made him stop in his tracks. There, tucked between two crumbling stone foundations, was a small garden. Not an old garden from the town's heyday, but a current, actively maintained garden with tomato plants, beans, and what looked like squash. The plants were healthy and well-watered, which was particularly strange considering they were in the middle of a desert mountain environment. Someone had been taking care of this garden recently, probably within the last few days. Jake knelt down and touched the soil around the tomato plants. It was damp, which meant someone had watered these plants very recently. He stood up and looked around, suddenly feeling like he was being watched. The sensation was so strong that he actually called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" His voice echoed off the surrounding buildings and rocks, but there was no response. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Over the next few days, Jake continued to find small signs that someone had been using his ghost town. Tire tracks that led to the old mining office, too fresh to have been made by Thomas. During his last visit, a fire pit behind the saloon with ashes that were only a few days old. Most mysteriously, he kept smelling wood smoke in the evenings, even though he could never locate where it was coming from. The smoke smell was the most unsettling part. It would drift through the town just after sunset, carrying the unmistakable scent of burning pine and oak. Jake would follow his nose, checking every building and every possible source, but he never found so much as a warm ember. The smell would be strong one minute and completely gone the next, as if someone was very good at hiding their fires quickly. On his fourth night in Cerro Gordo, Jake decided to stay up late and try to solve the mystery. He positioned himself on the hotel's front porch, where he had a good view of most of the town, and settled in to wait. He brought a thermos of coffee and a warm jacket, prepared to spend the whole night watching if necessary. Around 10 o'clock, he saw something that made his heart race. A faint light appeared in one of the upper windows of the old mining office, flickering like candlelight or a small lantern. Jake watched for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. The light moved around the room, suggesting that someone was definitely up there. He climbed down from the porch as quietly as he could, and made his way across the street toward the mining office. The building was one of the sturdier structures in town, built from stone rather than wood. and it had served as the business center during Cerro Gordo's active years. Jake had explored the ground floor a few days earlier but hadn't paid much attention to the upper-level dot. As he got closer to the building, the light suddenly went out. Jake stopped and waited, listening for any sound that might tell him where the person had gone. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, he approached the front door of the mining office and tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, Jake used his phone's flashlight to navigate through the main room and up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The stairs creaked with every step, making it impossible to move quietly. When he reached the top, he found himself in a long room that had probably once been used for mining company offices. The room was empty, but Jake could smell the lingering scent of a recently extinguished candle. On the floor near one of the windows, he found a few drops of fresh candle wax. Someone had definitely been here just minutes before he arrived, but they had vanished completely. Jake spent another hour searching the building from top to bottom, but found no other signs of the mysterious visitor. No other way out of the building? No hiding places large enough for a person? Nothing that explained where they could have gone. It was as if they had simply disappeared into thin air. The next morning, Jake discovered that someone had been busy while he was investigating the mining office. The small garden behind the hotel had been freshly watered, and there were new footprints in the soft dirt around the plants. Whoever was sharing his ghost town was clearly determined to avoid being seen, but they weren't trying to hide the fact that they were there. Jake found himself in a strange situation. He legally owned this entire town, which meant that technically, whoever was living here was trespassing. But at the same time, he was curious rather than angry. Anyone who could survive in such a remote location had to be resourceful and self-sufficient. And the fact that they were maintaining a garden and being careful with fires suggested they respected the place and weren't just vandals or troublemakers. As he sat on the hotel porch that evening, watching for signs of his mysterious neighbors, Jake realized that his simple plan to explore his new property had become something much more complicated. He wasn't just the owner of a ghost town anymore. He was sharing it with people who clearly had their own reasons for being there, and he was going to have to decide what to do about that. Jake's 10th morning in Cerro Gordo started like all the others. He made his instant coffee on the small camp stove he'd brought, ate a granola bar while watching the sunrise paint the mountains, and planned out which buildings he wanted to explore that day. He'd been methodically working his way through every structure in town, making notes about what needed repair and what might be salvageable. Today he'd decided to focus on the old mining office again. The building had the best bones of any structure in town, with its solid stone walls and relatively intact roof. If he was going to make any part of Cerro Gordo livable, the mining office seemed like the most practical place to start. He brought some basic tools with him from Montana, figuring he might need to do some minor repairs during his stay. Nothing fancy, just a hammer, screwdriver, measuring tape, and a few other essentials. Jake had always been handy around the ranch, and he enjoyed the simple satisfaction of fixing things with his own hands. The morning air was still cool as he walked across the dusty main street toward the stone building. He'd left the front door unlocked after his nighttime investigation a few days earlier, and it swung open easily when he pushed on it. The main room was exactly as he'd left it, with dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight that streamed through the grimy windows. Jake spent about an hour checking the structural integrity of the walls and floor. The stone construction had held up remarkably well over the decades, much better than the wooden buildings that made up most of the town. There were a few loose stones that needed to be reset, and the windows would need new glass. But overall, the building was in surprisingly good shape. He was kneeling on the floor, examining what looked like water damage near one of the corners, when he heard a voice behind him that made his blood run cold. "Who the hell are you, and what are you doing in my town?" Jake spun around so fast that he lost his balance and fell backward onto his hands. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked to be in his early 60s, with gray hair, a weathered face, and the kind of lean build that came from years of hard physical work. He was holding a shotgun with the casual ease of someone who knew exactly how to use it, For a moment, neither man said anything. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he was sure the stranger could hear it. He slowly got to his feet, keeping his hands visible and trying to look as non-threatening as possible. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, his voice sounding steadier than he felt. "I bought this place last week from Thomas Whitfield." The man with the shotgun didn't lower his weapon, but his expression shifted from hostility to confusion. "You bought what now?" "The town, all of it. I've got the deed in my truck if you want to see it." Jake reached slowly toward his back pocket where he kept his wallet, but stopped when the shotgun barrel moved slightly in his direction. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the man said, "and start explaining what you mean by bought the town, because my family's been living here for 8 years and nobody told us anything about any sale." Jake felt his stomach drop. 8 years? This man was claiming that he and his family had been living in Cerro Gordo for 8 years. That changed everything. This wasn't just someone passing through or using the ghost town as a temporary shelter. These people had made this place their home. "Look," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable, "I don't know anything about your family being here. Thomas Whitfield inherited this place from his father, and he sold it to me because he couldn't afford the property taxes anymore. I've got all the paperwork to prove it." The man studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was telling the truth. Finally, he lowered the shotgun slightly, though he didn't put it down entirely. "Name's Earl Hutchins," he said. "And if what you're saying is true, then we've got ourselves a real problem here." Earl explained that he and his family had moved to Cerro Gordo after losing their ranch in a foreclosure 8 years earlier. They'd been looking for a place where they could live quietly and cheaply, away from the world that had failed them so badly. When they'd found the abandoned ghost town, it had seemed like a perfect solution. No neighbors to complain, no landlords to deal with, no bills except for the basic supplies they needed to survive. "We figured nobody cared about this place," Earl continued. "It's been sitting empty for over a century. We've been careful not to damage anything, and we've actually improved a lot of the buildings, made them livable again." Jake listened to Earl's story with growing understanding and sympathy. This man wasn't a squatter or a criminal. He was a father and husband who'd been trying to provide for his family in the only way he could. The fact that he'd been doing it on land that technically belonged to someone else was complicated, but Jake could understand how it had happened. "How many people are we talking about?" Jake asked. "4 of us," Earl replied. "Me, my wife Martha, our son Danny, and his little girl Lucy. Danny's been having a hard time since he got back from Afghanistan. This place has been good for him, quiet, peaceful, helps him deal with things." The mention of a veteran struggling with what sounded like PTSD hit Jake hard. His own nephew had served 2 tours in Iraq and had come home a different person. Jake knew how hard it could be for soldiers to readjust to civilian life, especially when they were dealing with trauma. "Where is everyone else right now?" Jake asked. Earl's jaw tightened. "Safe. That's all you need to know until we figure out what we're going to do about this situation." Jake could understand Earl's protective instincts. The man had been living peacefully with his family for 8 years, and now a stranger had shown up claiming to own their home. Of course he was going to be defensive and suspicious. "Earl, I want you to know that I'm not here to cause trouble for you or your family," Jake said. "This whole situation is as much of a surprise to me as it is to you. I had no idea anyone was living here when I bought the place." "So what happens now?" Earl asked. "You going to call the sheriff and have us arrested for trespassing?" Jake had been asking himself the same question since Earl had first appeared in the doorway. Legally, he had every right to evict the Hutchins family. They were living on his property without permission, regardless of how long they'd been there or how good their intentions were. But morally, the situation was much more complicated. These people had made Cerro Gordo their home. They'd invested 8 years of their lives in this place, maintained it, improved it, and built a life here. Earl's son was a veteran who was apparently using the peace and isolation of the ghost town to heal from whatever he'd experienced in the war. And there was a child involved, a little girl who probably didn't understand why this stranger was suddenly threatening the only home she'd ever known. "I don't know what happens now," Jake admitted, "but I think the first step is for me to meet your family. If we're going to figure this out, we all need to be part of the conversation." Earl considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but I want your word that you're not going to do anything hasty. No calling the authorities, no lawyers, nothing like that until we've had a chance to talk this through?" "You have my word," Jake said. Earl finally lowered his shotgun completely and leaned it against the wall. "Follow me then. But move slow. And keep your hands where I can see them. My family's been through enough without having to worry about whether some stranger means them harm." As they walked out of the mining office together, Jake realized that his simple plan to explore his new ghost town had just become infinitely more complicated. He wasn't just the owner of a piece of Old West history anymore. He was potentially displacing a family that had nowhere else to go. Earl led Jake down the main street, past the saloon and the general store, toward the old hotel at the far end of town. As they walked, Jake noticed details he'd missed during his earlier explorations. The wooden sidewalks had been recently repaired, in several places with fresh lumber. Someone had cleared debris from around the buildings and even replanted some native shrubs near the hotel's front porch. "You've done a lot of work on this place," Jake observed. Earl nodded, his expression still guarded but slightly less hostile than it had been in the mining office. 8 years gives you time to fix things up. This town was falling apart when we got here. We've probably put more work into these buildings than anyone has since the original miners left." They reached the hotel and Earl paused at the front steps. "Before we go in, I need you to understand something. My family's been hurt before. We lost everything once already, and it nearly destroyed us. When we found this place, it gave us hope again. So, if you're planning to kick us out, I'd rather you just say so now instead of getting their hopes up." Jake could hear the pain in Earl's voice, and it reminded him of his own struggles with the ranch. The fear of losing everything you'd worked for was something he understood all too well. "Earl, I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just want to understand the situation before I make any decisions." Earl studied Jake's face for another moment, then nodded toward the hotel. "They're downstairs. We converted the basement into living space. It's warmer in winter and cooler in summer, plus it's out of sight if anyone comes snooping around." The hotel's front door opened with the same loud creak Jake remembered from his first night in town. Inside, the lobby looked different than it had during his earlier visit. Someone had swept away most of the debris and arranged some old furniture into a sitting area. The broken windows had been covered with clear plastic sheeting, and there were signs that people actually used this space. Earl led him to a door behind the main staircase that Jake hadn't noticed before. It opened onto a narrow wooden stairway that descended into what had once been the hotel's basement. As they went down the stairs, Jake could smell something cooking, something that smelled remarkably like homemade soup. The basement had been completely transformed into a comfortable living space. The stone walls had been insulated with salvaged materials, and the floor was covered with mismatched rugs that looked like they'd been collected from various sources over the years. String lights powered by what appeared to be a car battery provided warm lighting throughout the space. The area was divided into different sections, using hanging blankets and salvaged room dividers. Jake could see a kitchen area with a propane stove, a living space with chairs and a small table, and what looked like sleeping areas tucked into the corners. Everything was clean and organized, giving the impression of people who took pride in their home despite its unconventional location. "Martha, Danny, Lucy," Earl called out. "We've got company." A woman emerged from behind one of the hanging blankets, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She appeared to be in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen her share of hardships. This had to be Martha, Earl's wife. "This is Jake Morrison," Earl explained. "He says he bought the town from Thomas Whitfield." Martha's expression immediately became wary, but she stepped forward and extended her hand. I'm Martha Hutchins. I suppose you'll want to see some identification or something." "That's not necessary," Jake said, shaking her hand. "I'm just trying to understand the situation." A younger man appeared from another section of the basement, and Jake could immediately tell this was Danny, Earl's son. He was probably in his early 30s, with the kind of alert, watchful posture that Jake had seen in other veterans. Danny didn't offer to shake hands, instead positioning himself where he could keep an eye on both Jake and the stairway they'd come down. "Danny served 3 tours in Afghanistan," Earl said, his voice filled with pride and concern. "He's been having a tough time adjusting since he got back." Danny's jaw tightened slightly at his father's words, but he didn't say anything. Jake could sense the tension in the younger man and decided not to push for conversation. He knew from his nephew's experience that some veterans needed time to feel comfortable around strangers. "And where's Lucy?" Earl asked, looking around the basement. "I'm right here, Grandpa," came a small voice from behind one of the room dividers. A little girl stepped out, and Jake estimated she was probably around 8 years old. She had her grandmother's steady gaze, but with the natural curiosity of a child, who wasn't quite sure whether this stranger was friend or foe. "Hi there," Jake said, crouching down to be at her eye level. "I'm Jake." "I'm Lucy," she replied then, added with the matter-of-fact tone that only children can manage. "Are you going to make us leave?" The question hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. Here was a little girl who had grown up in this ghost town, who probably considered it the only real home she'd ever known, and she was already worried about losing it. Jake glanced up at the adults, who were all watching his reaction carefully. "I don't know yet, Lucy," he said honestly. "That's what we're all trying to figure out." Martha gestured toward the kitchen area. "I was just making soup for lunch. There's plenty if you'd like to stay and eat with us. Might be easier to talk about things over a meal." Jake accepted the invitation and soon found himself sitting at a small table with the Hutchins family, eating what turned out to be excellent vegetable soup made from the garden he'd discovered behind the hotel. As they ate, the family's story gradually came out. Earl and Martha had owned a small ranch in Colorado until a combination of drought, falling cattle prices, and medical bills from Earl's heart attack had forced them into foreclosure. They'd lost everything except their pickup truck and a few personal belongings. Danny had just returned from his final deployment and was struggling with nightmares and anxiety that made it difficult for him to hold down a regular job. "We were living in our truck, moving from one campground to another," Martha explained. "It's hard to find work when you don't have an address, and harder still when you're trying to take care of a little girl and a son who's dealing with his own problems." Danny's daughter Lucy had been living with her grandparents since her mother had left when she was just 3 years old. Her mother couldn't handle Danny's struggles with PTSD and had simply disappeared one day, leaving a note saying she needed to find herself. "We were getting desperate," Earl continued. "Winter was coming and we couldn't keep living in the truck. That's when we remembered this place. I'd been here once as a kid with my grandfather, who used to tell stories about the old mining days. We drove up here just to see if it was still standing. When they'd found Cerro Gordo empty and abandoned, it had seemed like a miracle. Here was shelter, privacy, and space for Danny to heal without the pressures and noise of the modern world. They'd moved into the hotel basement and slowly began making it livable. The first winter was rough," Martha admitted. "We didn't really know what we were doing, but we learned." Earl got the wood stove working. I figured out how to preserve food without refrigeration, and Danny started feeling better with all the space and quiet. Lucy had thrived in the unconventional environment. Martha, who had been a teacher before, they lost the ranch, had homeschooled her using books they'd bought at library sales and downloaded materials when they made trips to town for supplies. The little girl knew more about mining history, desert ecology, and self-sufficient living than most adults. "She's never really known any other life," Martha said, watching her granddaughter help clear the dishes. "This is home to her." As Jake listened to their story, he felt the weight of the decision he was facing. These weren't just squatters taking advantage of an abandoned property. They were a family that had been broken by circumstances beyond their control and had rebuilt themselves in this forgotten corner of the world. Evicting them wouldn't just be a legal matter, it would be destroying the only stability and peace they'd found in years, but at the same time, Jake had his own problems. He bought this ghost town with money he couldn't really afford to lose, hoping it might provide some kind of solution to his own financial struggles. Could he really afford to just walk away from his investment? The afternoon passed quickly. As the family showed Jake around their underground home and explained how they'd learned to live completely off the grid. They had solar panels hidden behind the hotel that powered their lights and a small refrigerator. They collected rainwater and snow for drinking, and had even figured out how to maintain a small composting toilet system that didn't contaminate the groundwater. As evening approached and the time came for Jake to return to his truck for the night, he realized that his simple real estate purchase had become something much more complicated. He wasn't just dealing with property ownership anymore. He was holding the future of an entire family in his hands. Jake barely slept that night. He lay in the back of his pickup truck, staring up at more stars than he'd ever seen in his life, trying to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lucy's face asking if he was going to make them leave. The kid was 8 years old, and this ghost town was the only real home she'd ever known, but then he'd think about his own ranch back in Montana, about the bills piling up on his kitchen table and the bank breathing down his neck. He'd bought this place with money he couldn't afford to lose, hoping it might somehow help solve his financial problems. Now he was discovering that doing the right thing might mean walking away from his only chance to save everything he'd worked for his entire life. When morning came, Jake made his usual instant coffee and sat on the hotel porch watching the sunrise paint the mountains. The Hutchins family was already up and moving around. He could smell breakfast cooking and hear quiet voices from the basement below. Normal family sounds that made this place feel less like a ghost town and more like a home. Around 8 o'clock, Earl emerged from the hotel and walked over to where Jake was sitting. The older man looked like he hadn't slept much either. "Mind if I sit down?" Earl asked. "It's your porch," Jake replied, then caught himself. "Sorry, I didn't mean that the way it sounded." Earl settled into one of the old chairs with a grunt. "No, you're right. Legally speaking, it's your porch now." "That's the problem we're dealing with, isn't it?" They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both men lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Earl spoke up. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About having the deed and all the paperwork. I believe you. Question is, what do we do about it?" Jake had been asking himself the same thing all night. "I honestly don't know, Earl. This isn't a situation they cover in real estate law books." "I could try to buy the place from you," Earl offered. "I've got my military pension coming in every month. It's not much, but it's steady. Problem is, I don't have any savings left. We spent everything we had just trying to keep the ranch before we lost it." Jake did some quick math in his head. Even if Earl could afford to make monthly payments, it would take years to pay off what Jake had invested, let alone what the property might actually be worth. And that was assuming Jake could afford to wait that long for his money, which he couldn't. "What about your son?" Jake asked. "Does Danny get any disability benefits from the military?" Earl's expression darkened. "He's supposed to, but the VA keeps denying his claims. Says there's not enough evidence that his problems are service-related. Meanwhile, the kid can barely sleep through the night without having nightmares about things that happened over there." Jake had heard similar stories from other veterans. The system that was supposed to take care of soldiers after they came home was broken in ways that hurt the people who had sacrificed the most. It was another injustice in a world that seemed full of them. "Look, Earl, I want to be straight with you about something. I didn't buy this place as some kind of investment opportunity. I bought it because my own ranch is in trouble. I owe more money than I can pay, and I was hoping maybe I could turn this ghost town into something that would help me save my family's land." Earl nodded slowly. "I figured it was something like that. Man doesn't drive 800 miles to spend $100 on a ghost town unless he's pretty desperate himself. So we're both in the same boat, in a way," Jake continued. both trying to save something important to us, both running out of options. They were interrupted by Martha calling from the hotel entrance. "Earl, breakfast is ready." "Jake, you're welcome to join us if you'd like." Jake accepted the invitation and soon found himself back in the basement dining area, eating scrambled eggs and bacon that somehow tasted better than any breakfast he'd had in months. Lucy was full of questions about his ranch in Montana, wanting to know about the cattle and whether he had horses. "Do you have any kids, Mr. Jake?" Lucy asked as she worked on her eggs. "No, I never got married," Jake replied. "Just me and the cattle, most of the time." "That sounds lonely," Lucy said with the blunt honesty that only children can manage. "Sometimes it is," Jake admitted, glancing around at the family gathered around the small table. He couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal with other people like this. Most of his meals back home were eaten alone while standing at the kitchen counter, going over bills or ranch records out after breakfast. Danny approached Jake for the first time since they'd met. The younger man had been quiet and watchful, but now he seemed ready to talk. "Mind if I show you something?" Danny asked. Jake followed him up the stairs and out of the hotel. Danny led him to a small building behind the main street that Jake had assumed was just another storage shed. But when Danny opened the door, Jake discovered something remarkable. The building had been converted into a workshop, with hand tools organized neatly on the walls and several pieces of furniture in various stages of repair. There was an old rocking chair that had been beautifully restored, a table with intricate carved details, and what looked like a child's toy chest that had been lovingly painted with desert flowers. "I made that for Lucy last Christmas," Danny sighed, pointing to the toy chest. Wood came from some of the collapsed buildings around town. Seemed better to turn it into something useful rather than let it rot. Jake examined the craftsmanship closely. The work was professional quality, the kind of furniture that would sell for good money in the right market. "This is incredible work, Danny. Where did you learn to do this?" "My grandfather taught me when I was a kid. After I got back from Afghanistan, working with my hands was one of the few things that helped quiet the noise in my head. Something about focusing on the wood, making something beautiful out of something broken." Danny showed Jake several other pieces he'd completed over the years. All of them were made from salvaged materials found around the ghost town, transformed into functional and beautiful furniture through skill and patience. "I've been thinking," Danny said as they looked at his work. "Maybe there's a way we could work together on this. You need this place to be profitable, and we need somewhere to live. What if we could find a way to make both things happen?" Jake was intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, people pay good money to experience authentic Old West stuff, right? This place is as authentic as it gets. And we've learned how to live here, how to make it work. Maybe we could turn that into something people would want to visit." The idea had merit. Jake had seen how much people paid to stay at dude ranches and Western-themed resorts. But Cerro Gordo was the real thing, not some sanitized tourist attraction. People could come here and experience what life was actually like in a genuine mining town. "You mean like a bed and breakfast kind of thing?" Jake asked. "Something like that. We could fix up some of the other buildings, make them comfortable for guests. Mom used to be a teacher, so she could do educational programs about the history. I could teach woodworking classes, show people how to make things with hand tools. Even Lucy could be part of it, showing kids what it's like to live off the grid." Jake felt a spark of excitement for the first time since arriving in Cerro Gordo. This could actually work. Instead of trying to choose between his financial needs and the Hutchins family's home, maybe there was a way to serve both. But even as the possibilities began to take shape in his mind, Jake knew there would be enormous challenges. They'd need permits, insurance, proper facilities for guests. They'd have to bring electricity and water up the mountain, improve the access road, and meet safety codes. All of that would require more money than Jake had, and probably more than he could borrow against a ghost town in the middle of nowhere. "It's a good idea, Danny," Jake said finally. "But I'm not sure how we'd pay for all the improvements we'd need to make. I'm already stretched pretty thin financially." Danny nodded. his expression disappointed but not surprised. Yeah, I figured that might be a problem. It was just a thought. As they walked back toward the hotel, Jake found himself wrestling with a decision that seemed to have no good answers. He could exercise his legal rights and evict the family, but that would destroy the only stability they'd found and probably traumatize a little girl who'd done nothing wrong. Or he could walk away from his investment and go back to Montana to watch his own family ranch slip away. Piece by piece, either choice would hurt people who didn't deserve it. Either choice would mean giving up on something important. And Jake was running out of time to figure out which sacrifice he could live with. Jake spent 3 more days in Cerro Gordo, and with each passing hour, the idea of a partnership seemed less crazy and more like the only solution that made sense. He found himself working alongside the Hutchins family, helping Earl patch a roof, watching Martha teach Lucy her daily lessons, and learning from Danny about the intricacies of restoring old wood on his last evening before he had to return to Montana. Jake called a family meeting in the hotel basement. The 5 of them sat around the small table where they'd shared so many meals, and Jake laid out his proposal. I've been thinking about what Danny said, about turning this place into something people would want to visit. I think it could work, but it's going to take all of us working together to make it happen. Earl leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the table. What exactly are you proposing? A partnership. You folks can stay here, make this your permanent home, but we work together to turn Cerro Gordo into a destination. Not some fake tourist trap, but a real place where people can experience authentic Western history. Martha looked skeptical. That sounds expensive. How would we pay for all the improvements we'd need? Jake had been thinking about that problem. For days, we start small, really small. We use what we've got and build from there. Danny's already shown me that we can make beautiful things from the materials that are lying around. We don't need to rebuild everything at once. He pulled out a notebook where he'd been sketching ideas. Look, we've got the hotel basement where you're living now. That could become the family quarters. The main floor of the hotel could be restored to offer rooms for guests who want the full ghost town experience. We fix up the saloon so people can have drinks and meals like they would have in the 1870s. Lucy's eyes lit up. Like a real Old West town where people can come and pretend to be cowboys? Exactly like that, Jake said, smiling at her enthusiasm. But here's the thing that makes us different from all those theme parks. This is the real deal. These buildings actually house miners and their families. The stories we tell are true stories, not made-up ones. Danny had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now he spoke up. What about the money side of things? Even starting small, we're going to need cash for materials, permits, insurance, all that legal stuff. Jake had an answer for that too, though it scared him to say it out loud. I sell my ranch in Montana. The room went silent. Earl was the first to speak. Jake, you can't do that. That ranch is your family's legacy. Maybe, Jake said. But what's the point of keeping something that's slowly killing me financially? I've been fighting a losing battle for years. The ranch is worth enough to pay off my debts and give us startup capital for this project. And honestly, after spending time here with all of you, I'm not sure I want to go back to working alone. Martha reached across the table and touched Jake's hand. Are you sure about this? You've only known us for 2 weeks. Jake looked around. The table at their faces? In 2 weeks, these people had become more like family to him than anyone he'd known in years. I'm sure. But I need to know that you're all committed to making this work. It's going to be hard. We'll be living and working together every day, and there will be times when we want to strangle each other. Earl chuckled. Son, we've been living in a basement together for 8 years. We already know about wanting to strangle each other. Over. The following months, Jake's crazy plans slowly began to take shape. He returned to Montana and spent 6 weeks getting his ranch ready for sale. It was harder than he'd expected, saying goodbye to the land his grandfather had bought and his father had improved. But every time he doubted his decision, he thought about the peace he'd felt in Cerro Gordo and the sense of purpose that came from working toward something with other people. The ranch sold faster than Jake had hoped to a young couple who promised to continue running cattle on the land. Jake used part of the proceeds to pay off his debts and invested the rest in their ghost town venture. When he returned to Cerro Gordo with a truck full of supplies and equipment, the transformation had already begun. The Hutchins family had spent the winter months cleaning and organizing every building in town. Danny had restored 3 more pieces of furniture and started working on plans for expanding his workshop. Martha had been researching the town's history at the county library, gathering stories and photographs that could be used for educational programs. Even Lucy had been busy. She'd created a detailed map of the town with descriptions of what each building had been used for during the mining days. Her childish handwriting and simple drawings gave the map a charm that no professional designer could have matched. The real work began in spring. Jake hired a contractor to help with the major structural repairs, but most of the work was done by the partnership team. Earl's construction background proved invaluable as they reinforced foundations and replaced rotted beams. Martha's teaching skills came in handy when they needed to research historical accuracy for their restoration efforts. Danny surprised everyone by becoming the project manager. His military training had taught him how to organize complex operations, and his attention to detail ensured that every repair was done properly. Working on the restoration seemed to give him the sense of purpose he'd been missing since leaving the army. They started with the hotel, converting the main floor into guest accommodations while keeping the basement as the family's private living space. Each room was furnished with pieces that Danny had restored or built from salvaged materials. The beds were simple but comfortable, the kind that might have been used by traveling miners and merchants in the 1870s. The saloon was their next priority. They rebuilt the bar using wood from a collapsed building and restored the old piano that had somehow survived more than a century of abandonment. Martha found recipes for period-appropriate drinks and meals, though they made sure to include modern safety standards in their food preparation. The biggest challenge was getting utilities to the site. Running electricity up the mountain was expensive, but they found a company that specialized in renewable energy systems. Solar panels were installed on the roofs of several buildings, hidden from view to maintain the historical appearance. A well was drilled to provide fresh water, and a modern septic system was installed to handle waste from future guests. By their first summer of operation, Cerro Gordo was ready to welcome visitors. They started small, advertising through historical societies and Western heritage groups. Their first guests were a family from California who wanted their teenage sons to experience life without video games and social media. The boys arrived sullen and resistant, clearly upset about being dragged to a place with no cell phone service. But by the end of their 3-day stay, they were helping Danny in his workshop and asking Martha if they could come back next summer. "It's like stepping back in time," their father wrote in the guest book. But without losing the things that matter, like family and hard work and taking pride in what you create with your own hands. Word spread quickly through online reviews and travel blogs. By the end of their first season, they were booked solid through the following year. Families came to experience frontier life. Couples came for romantic getaways in an authentic Western setting. And history buffs came to walk through a genuine piece of America's past. Lucy became the unofficial mascot of Cerro Gordo. Guests loved hearing about the ghost town from someone who actually lived there, and her enthusiasm for sharing stories was infectious. She could tell visitors about the town's history, show them how to start a fire without matches, and explain how her family had learned to live completely off the grid. Danny's woodworking classes became one of their most popular offerings. Guests would spend hours in his workshop, learning to use hand tools and creating simple projects to take home. For many visitors, it was their first experience making something useful with their own hands, and Danny found deep satisfaction in teaching skills that had nearly been lost in the modern world. Martha developed educational programs that brought school groups to Cerro Gordo for overnight field trips. Students would spend 3 days learning about mining history, frontier life, and environmental conservation. Teachers raved about how the hands-on experience brought history to life in ways that Textbooks never could. As their second winter approached, the partnership had evolved into something none of them had expected. They weren't just business partners anymore. They were a family that had chosen each other, united by their shared commitment to preserving a piece of history and creating something meaningful together. Jake often thought about his grandfather's ranch and wondered what the old man would think about his decision. But every morning when he woke up in his room above the saloon and looked out at the mountains surrounding their little town, he knew he'd made the right choice. He traded a legacy for a future, and it had turned out to be the best deal of his life. 2 years after Jake first drove up that dusty mountain road with a $100 cashier's check in his pocket, Cerro Gordo had become something none of them could have imagined. What started as a desperate gamble by a struggling rancher and a chance encounter with a hidden family had grown into one of the most unique tourist destinations in the American West. The transformation was visible from the moment visitors reached the top of the mountain road. The weathered wooden sign that had once barely marked the town's existence had been restored and supplemented with a tasteful welcome center, where guests could learn about the town's history before beginning their experience. The building looked like it belonged in the 1870s. But it housed modern amenities like clean restrooms and a small gift shop filled with items handcrafted by the residents. Jake stood on the hotel's front porch on a crisp October morning, watching a group of middle school students from Phoenix explore the town with the kind of wide-eyed wonder that never got old. Martha was leading them from building to building, explaining how families had lived and worked in this remote mountain location more than a century ago. The kids hung on her every word, asking questions about everything from how miners found silver in the rocks to what people did for entertainment before television and video games. "Hard to believe this is the same place, isn't it?" Earl said, joining Jake on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully and looked out over their small kingdom. The main street was bustling with activity. Denny was in his workshop with a group of adult guests, teaching them how to use hand planes and chisels to shape wood. Laughter drifted from the saloon where Lucy was showing a family how to play 19th century parlor games. Even the old mining office had found new life as a museum where visitors could see authentic mining equipment and learn about the dangerous work that had built this community. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself," Jake admitted. "When I bought this place, I was just looking for some way to save my ranch. I never imagined it would turn into this." The success had come gradually, but it had been steady and sustainable. Their second year of operation had brought guests from all over the world. Travel writers had discovered Cerro Gordo and written glowing articles about the authentic Western experience they offered. Social media had helped spread the word, with visitors posting photos and videos that looked like scenes from a movie but were completely real. What set them apart from other tourist attractions wasn't just the authenticity of the buildings or the beauty of the mountain setting. It was the people. Guests didn't just visit Cerro Gordo. They became part of it for however long they stayed. They ate meals prepared from Martha's garden, learned skills that had been passed down through generations, and heard stories from people who had chosen to make this ghost town their home. Lucy, now 10 years old, had become something of a celebrity. Travel magazines had featured her as the girl who grew up in a ghost town, and she'd been interviewed by documentary filmmakers who were fascinated by her unique childhood. But despite all the attention, she remained the same curious, enthusiastic kid who genuinely loved sharing her home with visitors. "I like showing people that you don't need all the modern stuff to be happy," Lucy had told a reporter from National Geographic. "We've got everything we need right here, and we made it ourselves." Danny's transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. The quiet, watchful veteran who had struggled to find his place in the world had become the heart of their operation. His woodworking classes were booked months in advance, and he'd started selling his furniture pieces to collectors who appreciated authentic craftsmanship. More importantly, he'd found peace in this mountain sanctuary and had become a mentor to other veterans who came to Cerro Gordo seeking their own healing. "Working with my hands, teaching other people these old skills," It's given me purpose again, Danny had explained to a group of visiting military families. This place doesn't judge you for having bad days. It just asks you to contribute what you can. The business side of their venture had exceeded even Jake's most optimistic projections. They were charging premium prices for their authentic experience, and guests were happy to pay them. A 3-day stay in Cerro Gordo cost more than a week at most resorts, but visitors consistently said it was worth every penny. Martha had developed partnerships with universities and historical societies that brought academic groups to study frontier life and sustainable living practices. Danny's workshop had become a destination for craftspeople who wanted to learn traditional techniques. Even Lucy contributed to their income by leading special programs for children and families. The financial success had allowed them to expand their operation carefully and thoughtfully. They'd restored 2 more buildings into guest accommodations, each one furnished with period-appropriate pieces that Danny had crafted or restored. They'd improved the access road without destroying its rustic character, and they'd invested in renewable energy systems that kept their environmental impact minimal. But perhaps the most important change was what had happened to the people themselves. Earl's health had improved dramatically in the clean mountain air and stress-free environment. Martha had rediscovered her passion for teaching and had even started writing a book about their experiences. Danny had found a new sense of purpose and belonging that his military service had never provided. And Jake had discovered that sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted could lead you to everything you actually needed. He'd given up his family's ranch, but he'd gained a family that had chosen him just as he'd chosen them. He'd traded the isolation of working alone for the satisfaction of building something meaningful with people he cared about. The partnership had evolved into something deeper than a business arrangement. They'd become a family in every sense that mattered, bound together by shared struggles and shared dreams. They made decisions together, solved problems together, and celebrated successes together on quiet evenings after the last guests had left for the day. The 5 of them would gather on the hotel porch to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. These were the moments Jake treasured most, when the business side of their operation faded away and they were just people who had found each other against all odds. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Martha said one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the crystal-clear mountain sky. All those families who lived here in the 1870s, they came here looking for silver, hoping to strike it rich and solve all their problems. Did any of them find what they were looking for? Lucy asked. Martha smiled and looked around at her chosen family. "I think we did." The ghost town that had been abandoned and forgotten for more than a century was alive again, but in a way that honored its past while embracing its future. Visitors came seeking adventure and left with a deeper understanding of what really mattered in life. Children learned that happiness didn't require the latest technology or the biggest house. Adults rediscovered the satisfaction of creating something with their own hands. But for the 5 people who called Cerro Gordo home, the greatest treasure wasn't the silver that had once been pulled from these mountains, or the money that tourists brought to their business. It was the proof that broken things could be made whole again, that desperate situations could lead to unexpected blessings, and that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose for yourself. As Jake looked out over their little empire. One more time before heading inside for the night, he thought about that classified ad that had started it all. Ghost town for sale, $100, serious inquiries only. He'd gotten the bargain of a lifetime, but not in the way he'd expected. He'd bought a ghost town for $100, but what he'd really found was worth more than any amount of money could measure. He'd found home.